My question today is, what happened to Lady Wisdom? That's the question that plagued me as I was deciding what to preach today. When I considered John's opening words in the beginning, I couldn't get wisdom out of my mind. Today, among other things, I'd like to share what happens in the mind of a pastor as she creates a sermon. No one other than another pastor has any concept of what goes into the shaping of a sermon. I'd like to think that it just comes to me. Maybe ultimately it does. Maybe I take a seed, begin to allow it to grow, and the Spirit becomes a part of the process, shaping and pushing me as I develop what I'm supposed to say. The operative word is maybe. I'm not sure I can tell you precisely what the process is. It just is. I was recently asked to advise your council what I do with my time. I've never been asked that question previously. It seemed almost intrusive. Yet I attempted to answer the request, and at the top of my list was 10 to 20 hours a week for the preparation of a sermon. I imagine that surprises a lot of people. Who would guess that? Now, I'm not saying that every pastor spends that much time, but I would suggest that any pastor who consistently preaches a valuable sermon spends that much time. The operative word in that sentence is valuable. And I might add another word, provocative. Sermons should have value. They should also provoke, stir to action. If you don't have one or the other, and hopefully both, what's their purpose? Is it simply to give you something to listen to on a Sunday morning? And if that's all there is, what's the point? Years ago, when I first entered ministry, I looked for groups of pastors who gathered each week to study the lectionary texts. The lectionary was devised so that different texts within the Bible would be read. 19 denominations, including the disciples, created it. I used it almost exclusively when I first began to preach, but I no longer feel compelled to do that. It's not that I don't appreciate the lectionary. It's just that it can be somewhat restrictive. And today's sermon is just one example of why I don't always use it. This sermon refers back to another sermon. 2 weeks ago, in my sermon on John's birth narrative, I mentioned the texts of Sirach and Proverbs. I realized that Sirach, a book in the Apocrypha, is not one of the books in most Protestant Bibles. That notwithstanding, all of the Bibles that we used in seminary included the Apocrypha. Interestingly, the 1611 version of the King James Version Bible also included the Apocrypha. My reason for choosing to read Sirach is that it supports the verses in Proverbs. So now listen to these verses from Proverbs. Does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out, "To you, O people, I call, and my cry is to all who live." God created me at the beginning of God's work, the first of God's acts of long ago. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. Now hear these verses from Sirach. Wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High, she opens her mouth, and in the presence of God's hosts, she tells of her glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Before the ages, in the beginning, God created me, and for all the ages, I shall not cease to be. In the holy tent, I ministered before God, and so I was established in Zion. I didn't change the pronouns in these biblical texts. They are feminine, leading many scholars to speak of Lady Wisdom. For whatever reason, many pastors ignore these texts. John said the word was at the beginning, but so was wisdom. So what happened to her? According to these two texts, wisdom was also at the beginning. So why has she been ignored? It's been assumed by many that God used words to create the world. At least that's what the author of Genesis says. But surely many of us, including God, do not create words without wisdom. How do we know that God used words? Maybe God simply used wisdom without speaking a single word. And why would God say anything out loud when there wasn't anyone to hear? And how did the idea that God was male develop? Couldn't God have been female or no gender at all? Simply spirit? Listen to one explanation concerning God and pronouns. I quote, "In the relationship between the creator and the created, God is always the giver. Humankind is always the receiver. In all cultures of the world, the giver is masculine. The receiver is feminine. There are good reasons for that: psychological, biological, cultural, and historical. And that is the only reason God, invariably referred to in the Jewish Hebrew Bible, is masculine." Unquote. It's obvious from that individual's proclamation that there's another good reason for referring to God as male. That reason is male bias, prejudice in favor of the masculine. Whoever determined that giver is masculine? Where did that come from? My experience tells me that women are just as often givers as men are. So what happened to wisdom in these proclamations? There can be no question from the texts in Proverbs and Sirach that wisdom is feminine and was there at the very beginning of the world. Yet she's clearly ignored. Wisdom, of course, has no shape or form any more than words do. John speaks of the word being present at creation, but makes no mention of wisdom. I couldn't help but wonder why. Could it be that wisdom represents the feminine in God? There's little doubt that from time immemorial, it has been presumed that God is male. The question again is, why? Who decided that God is male? Did Leonardo da Vinci presume God was an old man with a long white beard? Of course he did. It was a presumption. Yet no one, to my knowledge, has ever seen God. God's response when Moses encountered God in the burning bush and asked God's name was this: I am who I am. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. To say those words in Hebrew is difficult. They sound like Yah. But since Jews believe God's name should never be spoken, they inserted the word Lord in all capital letters in place of God's name. And since Lord is presumed to be male, maybe that's how it all began. Who knows? So if the word of which John spoke in his gospel introduction was there at the very beginning, and if wisdom was also there, according to Proverbs and Sirach, which is it? Or were both there at the beginning of creation? And if so, why did only John's description take hold and the other was ignored? John's gospel refers back to creation, to the very beginning when God created light and darkness and every other thing that came into being. There's little question that God used words to create, at least according to Genesis. But didn't God also use wisdom to create? According to both Proverbs and Sirach, God not only used wisdom, but created wisdom as God's very first act. So is Genesis right in the order of creation, or are Proverbs and Sirach correct? Why no mention of Lady Wisdom in our creation story? Could Lady Wisdom possibly be the Spirit of God? It's undoubtedly true that those who gathered the story that made up the Bible were all, guess what, male. Is that why we've all always referred to God as he, when there's nothing to support God being male? Of course, it could be said that the Trinity refers to God as Father. But who created the Trinity? Many of us assume that the Trinity has existed as long as Christianity has existed, or that it's biblical, but it's not. It was solidified by the Council of Nicaea in 1325 AD. And the council was called by the Emperor Constantine. And I quote, Constantine himself presided, actively guiding the discussions and personally proposed the crucial formula expressing the relation of Christ to God in the creed issued by the council. Overawed by the emperor, the bishops, with two exceptions only, signed the creed, many of them much against their inclination, unquote. Well, that reminds me of what just happened in the House of Representatives, except that the United States has no person with the power of Constantine. The reason Constantine called the council was because he wanted to unify all of his conquered territories and believed that Christianity would help him do that. But Christianity in those days had many divisions and disagreements, and Constantine wanted to unify all of those divisions. So he called the council. In short, the council had very little to do with faith and everything to do with politics. Again, all those on the council, guess what, were men. The creed referred to is the Nicene Creed, something with which I grew up and which is still recited in many Christian churches. For those of you who may not have grown up with this creed, it begins this way. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. So why Father? Why not Creator, since it immediately follows with acts of creation? Some might argue that God is Father, since it's the name for Jesus usually used in the Lord's Prayer. Yet that raises another question. If that was really the prayer taught by Jesus to his disciples, why is it never mentioned in the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark? I don't raise these questions to deny any belief that exists within Christianity. My purpose in asking these questions is to make clear that much of what's accepted within Christianity was to help an emperor solidify his territory, and it's not necessarily true. And it's certainly undeniable that a patriarchal society with leaders who were all men decided to not only write all the biblical stories, but to solidify God as male in the process. So perhaps in an age when leaders aren't all male, it's okay to decide that God is spirit and beyond gender. John called the creative power the Word. Other texts call it wisdom. Are they the same thing and just different terms? Jesus said, wisdom is vindicated by all her children. What did he mean by that? According to one source, in some lines of Jewish thought, wisdom is personified as a way of speaking of God and by extension, God's purpose. So I end this sermon with the same question I asked at the beginning. What happened to Lady Wisdom and why? Amen.